Before there was Final Fantasy VII, Japanese-style retro RPGs hadn't taken off in the West yet. I mean, sure, there were some big ones on the SNES, but the genre just wasn't on the radar of the average gamer. 1996's Wild Arms on the PlayStation is the perfect example of this. Because it was released before the FF7 craze, it was overlooked by a lot of people that otherwise would have loved it. When I played it, I was in junior high and without a job, but I saved up enough money mowing lawns to get it. Wild Arms was created by the tiny developer Mediavision, which only made 2 games prior, and ironically, both were shooter games. Wild Arms thus represented the company's first foray into the RPG world, and it adopted many of the classic characteristics of the genre. Characters gain levels, use special abilities and items, and explore an immersive world with an epic story. Battles are turn-based and play out on the basis of each character's response statistic. The game's dungeons also feature many basic puzzles that need to be solved to progress, making it a bit like the Lufia games. The world of Wild Arms is also full of tools that can be obtained to allow the player to move through the game. For instance, Jack uses a grappling hook that can be used to traverse over pits, while Rudy's bombs can destroy boulders that stand in the party's way. In the same fashion, Cecilia's tear can magically open select doors. Each character can obtain 4 tools in total, each of which has some use in the game. It was a unique way to keep the player engaged even outside of the story and combat, and something that worked out well and stood out from many other games of its type. In a way, it kind of reminded me a little bit of using various items in the Zelda games to bypass hurdles in the dungeons. It's the same kind of feel. In terms of the story, Wild Arms takes place in a world that experienced a great war 1,000 years in the past, which was waged between the humans of Filgaia and the metal demons. The humans eventually defeated and sealed the demon leader, known as Mother, into a cocoon because they could no longer counter her rapidly regenerating body. Over the years though, a small number of demon loyalists succeeded in taking the incapacitated body of Mother and organizing an effort to locate pieces of her heart in the hopes of reviving her and seeking vengeance upon the humans. In the world of Wild Arms, ancient relic mechanics, or arms, are weapons stigmatized for granting uncontrollable power, and often make wielders of them into pariahs. One example of this is found in Rudy, one of the main characters. As an orphan, Rudy's daring rescue of a lost boy in a cave revealed to his village that he carried an arm, which led to him being an outcast. Another lead character, Jack, is a world-traveling treasure hunter and former knight of Arctica Castle. He searches for an ultimate power of sorts that will allow him to confront his troubled past. Cecilia is the Princess of Adelheid, greatly skilled in magic from a life spent studying in Curon Abbey. Despite her stature, she longs for adventure and is curious of the world around her. One thing that just has to be mentioned when it comes to Wild Arms is that many of the game's themes are very inspired by American Western films, which is especially interesting considering it was made in Japan. Its use of firearms, environmental settings, and other factors really show this effect even when mixed into a fantasy story of magic, dragons, and castles. Even the soundtrack has a lot of Western-style influence. This is evident throughout the game, and even from its opening seconds in the anime video intro. Indeed, the soundtrack features lots of acoustic guitars, mandolins, and especially whistling. This made the score completely unique in the annals of RPG history, and is something that fans have always recognized. It was definitely a risk that probably paid off for its originality. The game's decision to feature only 3 main characters was also a risk. This did allow the game to pack a lot more information and story into its characters, unlike some RPGs that featured huge casts. However, it could also be argued that the game's small array of characters made some of the character tropes that much more cliché. I can see both sides, but I do think the game's small number of characters allowed for the backstory of each to be explored in a way that many other RPGs could never do. Learning new things about the characters and their motivations as you progress through the game is one of the best aspects of Wild Arms. Wild Arms was one of those unique games that stood at the dawn of a new era, where 3D was first used in RPGs. As a result, a lot of its graphics, especially in battle, look extremely dated. The huge sized polygons and exaggerated character appearances really look subpar now, and the game hasn't held up well compared to several other games from the era that went with a 2D sprite-based look instead. However, this issue isn't apparent outside of combat, as all the other gameplay takes place in an overhead view, where 2D sprites look very similar to what one would expect from other 1990s RPGs. These visuals definitely look better in hindsight than the 3D battle graphics, and the animations actually still look really good today. As an avid RPG nut from the 1990s, I can tell you that if you like many of the other titles I featured on my channel, you'll definitely like Wild Arms as well. It's a straightforward classic RPG that didn't break entirely new ground, but added enough of a unique twist in its innovative Western feel and emphasis on puzzles. Its soundtrack also really stands out and is definitely one of its best aspects. It came out early in the life of the PlayStation, so it's not quite as polished as some of that system's later RPGs, but it's still a lot of fun. It's well worth playing today and is possibly one of the system's top 10 RPGs. I thought one of the best RPGs that came out on the PlayStation before Final Fantasy VII was Wild Arms. Honestly, I still feel it had a lot going for it back then too. It was a Western-themed title that turned a lot of heads before RPGs even caught on here, and it kind of stood out from the crowd too. The game had 3 distinct characters, and dungeons utilized puzzle solving in a fun way. It even had an interesting story that defied a lot of RPG cliches, and let's just say there were plenty of those back then. The positive reception Wild Arms received led to a solid fan base in the days when the PlayStation was the platform for RPGs. So what did the game's small developer Mediavision do? That's right, it created a follow-up and released it 3 years later in North America. It was known as Wild Arms Second Ignition in Japan, but here it was known as Wild Arms 2. And Wild Arms 2 brought back a lot of the best qualities from the original, but also innovated in a lot of ways too. Before I get into all that though, please make sure you like and subscribe to the channel for future retro gaming content. Now that that part's done with, what needs to be said first is that a lot of the things about Wild Arms 2 look just like Wild Arms on the surface. So yeah, it is true that the Western influence, battle system, arms, and menus are all strikingly similar to the original game, and Wild Arms 2 probably has the same feel you'd expect it to coming from that one. Even the game's font is exactly the same one used in the original. When you dive beneath the surface though, you will notice a lot of differences. I think the most obvious is probably the game's visual approach. Instead of a fully 2D overhead world with character sprites, this one uses a fully 3D polygonal world. The characters themselves are still sprites, but they're far more complex and better animated than those in the original. You can adjust the camera with the L1 and R1 buttons so it's easier to see what's around you, and this will be really helpful to you. But there will still be points where things obscure your vision as well. The visual feel is a lot like Xenogears and Grandia, and I think that style holds up really well. Battles still use 3D characters and 3D polygons, but the characters are a bit more realistic than they were in the first game. They still look blocky and a bit deformed, but this game shows you how much the graphical quality of PlayStation games improved even over the life of a single console. Outside of the enhanced character polygons, you probably won't notice much of a difference from the original Wild Arms though. All that said, you'll certainly be surprised to find out the first game's magic system, which used MP, was totally scrapped. It's replaced instead with force points, or FP, which is handled quite a bit differently. At the start of each battle, your party's FP is actually equal to the combined levels of your characters. There are both special abilities and force abilities. Special abilities require you to have a minimum number of FP to use, but don't expend the resource itself. Force abilities, on the other hand, do expend FP. It is a little confusing, but the only really important thing to remember is not to stress out too much about conserving FP because you do regenerate it over time anyway. You'll probably end up using a lot more special abilities than you think you will as a result. In addition to the magic system, the story of Wild Arms 2 is also quite a bit different from the first game too. this one still takes place in the land of Filgaia, where life is slowly dying and greenery is turning to desert. You play as Ashley Winchester, a soldier serving Maria's king. As the game begins, Ashley is sent on a mission to rescue a young boy named Tony Stark from 2 kidnappers. And no, we're not talking about Iron Man Tony Stark here. Ashley succeeds in rescuing Tony, but releases an ancient monster called Calivos in the process. He manages to slay the beast and save the day, but is punished for acting in insubordination of his orders. Nevertheless, Ashley's skill is recognized and he's promoted to a special musketeer unit called Arms. During his initiation ceremony though, a demon gate is opened and everyone is turned into monsters. Great. Ashley survives only by making contact with Argatlam, the legendary blade that saved the world from demons in the past. I did skip a few details here and there because there are some pretty major story spoilers, but I will say that guilt and a terrible revelation about the incident eat at Ashley throughout the adventure. Just like the first Wild Arms game, you do get to choose between 3 characters at the start. So instead of selecting Ashley, you can go with Brad, a former hero now war criminal, or Lilka, the young sorceress. Whichever you choose, their paths cross and all characters are important to the story, but the main protagonist really does seem to be Ashley. Once you finish the intro story for the first character you choose, you'll play the next ones anyway, so the order doesn't really matter too much. The 3 characters get wrapped up in a struggle against a terrorist organization called Odessa that is trying to conquer the world. If I had to say, the story of Wild Arms 2 is a bit darker and more serious than the first Wild Arms. It has some of the same charm for sure, but you'll definitely explore different themes. I enjoyed the humor packed into the English localization, but I don't think the localization itself was perfect. If you play this one today, you'll notice a few grammatical errors and odd translation choices, but I don't think it ruined the entire experience or anything like that. Wild Arms 2 allows your characters to advance in power beyond levels through upgrading your arms at shops. You can only upgrade each arm a maximum of 10 times though, and these 10 have to be divided between attack power, hit percentage, and bullets. This system really forces you into a lot of trade-offs, and you really have to make a lot of tough choices. Each of the 3 categories are more useful for certain arms, and you aren't really given very good guidance on it. In Wild Arms 2, you learn new spells almost in the exact same way as in the first game. You find crest items, combine 2 elements together on a grid, and gain a new spell. Wild Arms 2's composer was Michiko Naruke, the same one from the original game, so this definitely adopts a similar style as that one. You'll hear a few tracks with the distinct whistling sound that made the first one so unique, and that was a great touch I thought because it connected it to the world of the series. That being said though, there's also many tried and true songs that seem like they could have been lifted from the world of Breath of Fire or another RPG franchise from that time. At over 100 tracks, the score is huge. There's tons of variety here with multiple battle tunes and a different dungeon track for each dungeon in the game. And that fact alone certainly makes the soundtrack stand above almost all other RPGs of this era. My biggest criticism of Wild Arms 2 is that no locations even appear on the overworld map until you scan for them. So this means you end up wandering all around to every corner of the world using a scan a mission thingy until you find the next area. This is quite honestly a dumb mechanic. It's stupid and cumbersome and totally frustrating. It'll make you lose your mind and waste your time with more random encounters. It was just totally unnecessary. At the same time, I try to be a little forgiving about this because I do think Wild Arms 2 offers several great conveniences that kind of make up for this. One of the most refreshing is that you can actually avoid random encounters with weaker enemies. When you see a white exclamation point above your head, that means you can use scan to avoid getting into the battle. And man, I really wish more RPGs had this kind of feature. It really empowered me to choose when I would grind and when I would proceed in the story. Also, you can swap between characters during battle, and that was a really fun way to experiment with new options and adapt your party to enemy threats. Wild Arms 2 is an overlooked game that probably came out a bit too late, because in 2000, many people had already gone on to the PlayStation 2 or Dreamcast. But honestly, it's a solid RPG at its core, with fun characters, creative advancement mechanics, and an improved battle system. I do think the story was a bit convoluted, especially later in the game, but it was still an interesting tale I could get into. The story adopts enough themes from the first game so as not to make it completely alien to that universe, but it still ventures in enough new directions to make things fresh as well. I honestly think it struck a pretty good balance when it all comes down to it. Wild Arms 2 doesn't reinvent the RPG wheel whatsoever, but it does bring some great qualities that fans of the genre will love. In the end, I don't think it's quite as good as the first Wild Arms game, but it's still an admirable sequel that's worth playing. The Sony PlayStation birthed a lot of RPGs, many of which flew under the radar compared to their much more popular counterparts. Wild Arms and Wild Arms 2 both fit that bill for sure, but they still appealed to a cult following of RPG fans that became more and more plentiful in the mid-1990s. Both games became well known for their interesting stories and the unique incorporation of themes from US Westerns into a Japanese RPG. So at the heart of the PlayStation 2's popularity in 2002, it only seemed fitting that series developer Mediavision would deliver the third Wild Arms game to a hungry audience. And I'll just say it was a lot different from the previous games in a few ways. But did it live up to the first two and match the hype the fans had for it? I'll cover all aspects of the game and let you know the answer to that in this video, but before I do, please like this video, subscribe to my channel for more retro gaming content, and let me know your memories from Wild Arms 3 in the comments section below. Some of the core mechanics of the Wild Arms series are certainly present in Wild Arms 3, but the graphical presentation is much different from anything we saw before. It uses kind of a cel-shaded look that was popular at the time, with rigid black lines to outline the edges of the characters and enemies. There are still Western motifs and themes, and even font styles, but the characters themselves are kind of cartoony, and that may be a turnoff for some people. Wild Arms 3 also takes place on Filgaia, the same area from the other Wild Arms games. But this one appears to be different in some ways, like it's some kind of differently formed Filgaia in an alternative dimension or something. It's a world where drifters venture across the land searching for fortune and adventure, all with different motives for doing so. You start out as Virginia, a drifter upon a train who searches for her long-lost father. Out of sheer curiosity, she defies the crew's warnings and goes to an off-limits room. As she sees a mysterious light coming out of a chest inside, 3 other drifters break into the room, all with their weaponry ready to fire upon each other. They turn out to be Jet, Clive, and Gallows, 3 other drifters, and here's where you're able to choose between all 4. So just like the first 2 Wild Arms games, you then have to complete each character's prologue before moving on in the game, with each taking place before the train encounter. Jet is a boy suffering from amnesia, Clive is a trained bounty hunter tormented by his past, and Gallows attempts to live as a drifter rather than to follow in his family's priestly bloodline. Much of the story revolves around a feud with Janus, another drifter, and his gang of lackeys who aspire to take the mysterious treasure for themselves. But it's also about discovering the secrets of the world and the characters' pasts. The game honestly does a very good job of having the feel of what I would expect from any Wild Arms game, so thematically it won't seem like a big departure from the earlier ones. Combat, however, has been reinvented. It's a whole new animal here. First of all, your characters actually run around on the battlefield now rather than standing in a straight line. However, this doesn't seem to affect anything other than style, and there's no area-dependent spells or anything like that. In this one, you have the option of standard attacks, force abilities, and magic skills. The standard attack needs no explanation, as it's pretty standard in all RPGs. The force abilities expend force points, or FP, which are acquired after hitting enemies or getting hit yourself, and this mechanic functions kind of like a rage or limit break system. Magic skills are also dependent on FP, but casting them doesn't expend FP itself. They just require you to have a particular threshold for usage. Unlike the first 2 games, all characters are equipped with arms, which can be upgraded up to 15 times each, and all characters can also cast magic skills. Instead of crest graphs, your characters learn magic through guardians, deity-like beings that you equip onto individual characters. The Guardians determine which spells that character can use. Each character has 3 Guardian slots, but there are no weapons and armor in Wild Arms 3, which really threw me off at first. Instead, you equip the Guardians themselves with items that give various benefits, including unlocking skills or giving status immunities. The only downside is that if you unequip items from Guardians, that item is permanently lost in the process. You also gain personal skill points, or PS, which can be allocated to the skills Guardians unlock. This is the big customization system in Wild Arms 3, and I have to say it was pretty creative. It felt a little bit like the Guardian forces in Final Fantasy VIII, though not exactly the same. The interesting thing is that you can even swap your Guardian and skill configurations for each character during combat. So if you run into a boss you're having problems with or something like that, a change of this kind can be really helpful. There's also a system that allows you to avoid random encounters when your character's levels exceeds that of the nearby enemies. And honestly, this worked really well. It was a great convenience that lessened a lot of the frustration that came from most RPGs of this era. So big thumbs up on this. By far the worst thing about Wild Arms 3 though, is that they brought back the excruciating search system that forces you to emit a search beam thingy on the world map to find all the new locations. To say doing this is tedious would be a huge understatement, and I've never met a single Wild Arms fan who actually liked it. And if that wasn't enough, you can't even uncover new locations until you talk to the right NPCs who unlock that area, so to speak. So yeah, you'll be wandering around the whole world aimlessly doing this, detracting entirely from the gameplay and storyline and character development. You know, all those things that actually make RPGs fun in the first place. So in the end, I have mixed opinions on Wild Arms 3. I really dislike the visual style. The cel-shaded thing just isn't my cup of tea, and I don't think it holds up very well. It looks something out of a child's cartoon or something, and that's probably being nice. And like I said, the location search system was totally insane. On the other hand, the story was fairly interesting, the soundtrack was great, and the battles were fun. It's an enjoyable RPG that isn't too difficult and can give you 30 plus hours of enjoyment. Back when it first came out, I didn't appreciate Wild Arms 3 very much because of the downsides, but after playing it again now, I think it's worthy of a playthrough. A lot of fans of the series even consider it the best one, and even though I prefer the first 2 over it, I can understand that opinion. It's a solid RPG in an age where we still had all the turn-based games us retro fans loved. Back in my RPG playing prime, the first 3 Wild Arms games were appealing to a niche group of RPG fans who really appreciated their interesting story, puzzles, and especially the introduction of themes from the American West. But when Wild Arms 4 came out in 2005, it was a big shock to most of these fans, because it represented such a big departure. The Western motif is gone entirely, replaced with a fully futuristic setting. But not only that, the combat system was entirely revamped too. These 2 things were a big risk for the series for sure, but did they work out? I'll cover all aspects of Wild Arms 4 and let you know the answer to that question in this video. But before I get into all that, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know your memories of Wild Arms 4 in the comments below. Wild Arms 4 takes place both above and on Filgaia, the same location of the previous games in the series. And I say above Filgaia as well because Jude Maverick, the main character, comes from Seal, a town enclosed in a sphere floating high above the ground. He goes along living a happy life, but one day his entire conception of reality is shattered when he sees Bryonic ships rip through the sky and into his world. Out of curiosity, he sneaks inside one of the ships where he finds Yuli, a mysterious girl who appears to have been taken prisoner by the Bryonics. Jude finds a mysterious arm to fight against the Bryonics, but they eventually succeed in destroying Seal. In the aftermath of the tragedy, he departs in escape pods with Yuli and Arnaud, the drifter assigned to protect the mysterious girl. Their adventure begins in earnest as they set out to uncover the motives of the Bryonics and thwart their plans to endanger Filgaia. Combat is where Wild Arms 4 really did reinvent the wheel, because its hex-based battle system is definitely one of the most unique I've ever seen from a turn-based RPG. The way it works is that each battlefield is comprised of 7 hexagons, and your characters, enemies, and sometimes obstacles and objects are placed in random places. And the placement actually makes a ton of difference too. It can even determine whether the fight is even winnable in the first place. On a character's turn, you can move onto any adjacent, unoccupied hex so long as an enemy isn't on it. This means that you can join an ally on a hex as well. You can only attack enemies on an adjacent hex, and when there's multiple enemies on that hex, they all get hit by attacks. So maximizing this strategy is the key to plowing through everything. The only downside is that enemy attacks onto allied hex also hit all of your allies standing there, so you really need to plan around this possibility. Bosses also have their own unique abilities that blow the power of the normal enemies out of the water. They can do things like move out of the hex in time to evade your attacks, unleash super powerful attacks of their own, counterattack, or even do things like spawn adds. I liked how each and every boss encounter is so different. It seems like they actually put a lot of design time into this, and you really have to consider positioning for both offensive and defensive purposes. Unlike Wild Arms 3, Wild Arms 4 gives you one overarching force meter for all characters on the right side of the screen. When you gain enough FP, you can use force abilities that are specific to each character. However, you can also unlock hidden combination force abilities called combination arts at random when characters and combinations are standing in the same hex. Some combination arts involve 2 characters, others involve 3, and there are even 2 combination arts that involve all 4 characters. The combat animations for these attacks are pretty epic too, with some of them taking longer than I'd want, but they're super powerful. Each character has a specific set of abilities that they gain as they level, which is a lot more basic than the Guardian system from Wild Arms 3, but also gives each character a defined role and function. At a high level view, Jude is the quick attacker, Yuli is the healer, Arnaud is the offensive magic specialist, and Raquel is the hard-hitting powerhouse. Arms can be upgraded at save points by using components called altar points that you find throughout the game, and you can actually choose whether to upgrade attack power, which increases your damage, or action, which allows you to make multiple hits. Dragon fossils also allow you to upgrade the accuracy, critical hit, bullets, and usability ratings of your arms. So you can really customize each character's weaponry the way you want, and this was really cool. The other form of customization that comes into play is the character growth chart, a system that allows you to allocate points gained through leveling into your character's power. You gain 1 point with each level up, and you can allocate points to acquire skills quicker than you would through normal leveling. This was a fun way to get the target abilities you always wanted to get, but it comes at the expense of other skills too. When you actually get to the level where the skill is normally learned, the points are refunded to you as well to reallocate into other skills. One more thing too, if the future story and revamped battle system didn't throw you off, Wild Arms 4 also incorporates the ability to both slide and jump for the first time. This means that when you're exploring the world, you'll have to do a lot of platforming, and you can fall in many places. This is a huge change from other games in the Wild Arms series, and really gave me some Tower of Babel vibes from Xenogears. It's also kind of funky how the game just transitions into this mode from the roaming 3D world. When it comes down to it, I have mixed opinions on Wild Arms 4, with some negatives and some things that genuinely impressed me. The story was an interesting concept, but there isn't much actual direction at times, and I really missed the Wild West flavor. That said, the hex-based battle system gets big creativity points, as it worked like nothing I had ever seen before and was actually fun. I didn't like the platforming because I think the game would have worked better as a traditional Wild Arms game where you use tools to solve the puzzles rather than action platforming. There isn't any world map at all, which sounds like it would kind of suck, but this means that the stupid search system from the previous Wild Arms games is out the window too, so that is a big win. I also found Raquel to be way too powerful. She is pretty slow, but her attacks are uber strong, and you can get around her speed deficiency through various buffs. Even so, the characters are fairly interesting, and the soundtrack is quality as well. It was done by the same team that did the previous games. This was the Wild Arms game that took the most risks, and some love it for that. But I think outside of the innovative combat, I would take the feel of the first 3 Wild Arms games over this one. If turn-based RPGs are your jam, you'll still want to give this one a try. Otherwise, there are several in this genre that are far better on the PlayStation 2. By the end of 2006, Mediavision had created 5 Wild Arms games, 4 mainline titles, and a remake of the first one called Alter Code F. By that time, the PlayStation 2's glory days were in the rearview mirror, and the PlayStation 3 was released in November of that year. Even so, Mediavision had spent the previous year working on a follow-up to their RPG franchise. The result was Wild Arms 5, which came out in August of 2007. Even though many gamers had already moved on to the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 at this point, some others stayed behind to enjoy the latest offering. But was it worth it? And how did it match up to the other Wild Arms games? In this video, I'll give you a full overview of the game and answer those very questions. Before I get into all that though, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and let me know your memories from Wild Arms 5 in the comments section below. Wild Arms 5 throws you into the role of Dean, a young and eager dreamer who aspires to leave his village of Capo Branco and become a golem hunter, which from what I can tell is some kind of archaeologist. When he ventures into the mountains with his friend Rebecca, the two see a giant golem arm fall from the sky and into a cave. Inside, they find the hand clutching a mysterious woman who has amnesia. The only 2 things she can remember is that her name is Avril and the words Johnny Appleseed. The 2 arms Avril was holding are given to Dean and Rebecca, who decide to solve the mysteries of Avril's past. The adventure basically takes off from there, and in the process of it, you'll find 6 total playable characters, each with their own backstories that fit pretty well into the Wild Arms 5 universe. And those drifters wandering around, yeah, they're still here and in this one too. There are also several other recurring themes from the other Wild Arms games, such as the setting in Filgaia, the existence of ancient weaponry called arms, and the Guardians. But outside of those things, the story is distinct enough as well so as not to feel like a complete rehash. There were a few things about the Varuni government storyline in particular that surprised me in a good way, so I'll give it props for that. In a lot of ways, Wild Arms 5 looks and feels like a direct sequel to Wild Arms 4, and indeed, many of the gameplay mechanics closely match those of its predecessor. The most obvious one I think is the combat, which is largely carried over from Wild Arms 4. On the surface, it looks nearly exactly the same as it did there, but it actually represents a pretty big evolution of it. This is because in Wild Arms 5, your characters can only be placed in hexagons, and each one holds a maximum of 3. Sharing a hexagon with another character not only allows for special combo attacks, but also provides different elemental effects. For instance, if you move into a hexagon with poison, your character will suffer from it. But if they move out of that hexagon and into another, you won't carry that ailment with you. In addition, characters and enemies can both move and take an action in the same turn, and attacks target everything within a hex rather than individual characters or enemies. And if all those changes didn't confuse you yet, each character's hit points are now completely filled after each battle. There are a few other differences too, such as battle parties of 3 rather than 4, but the experience is pretty similar overall, and improved in my opinion. The dungeons are filled with platforming elements that we first saw brought into the series in Wild Arms 4, but this one also adds more puzzles as well. You'll have to do things like push blocks around, hit switches in the right order, and even use your arms to shoot out orbs and other objects. Not only are the puzzles more imaginative here, they're also fun, and each dungeon has unique ones. There's something to be said for that. Series composer Michiku Naruke was still at Mediavision while Wild Arms 5 was developed, but she was assigned to other projects and never made any contributions to the game. The soundtrack of Wild Arms 5 brings back Masato Kouda, who had worked on previous Wild Arms games, along with Noriyasu Agamatsu, a newcomer to the series. And despite the change in personnel, I actually think this is the best soundtrack in the series since the first game. That's because it brings back a lot of the whistling sounds and western flavor that really made the first title special. In the end, Wild Arms 5 is a step up from Wild Arms 4. I like most of the changes to the combat system, and having your hit points refilled after each battle was a nice touch that streamlined the gameplay. I guess you could say it also trivialized some of the game too, especially at the beginning, but it's still a change that's held up well over time. The story was well constructed, and the characters are more lovable than they were in Wild Arms 4 as well. I still can't quite recommend Wild Arms 5 over the first two Wild Arms games, but it still represents the franchise well and is packed with great lore. Even before the release of Wild Arms 5, MediaVision unveiled plans to create a Wild Arms game for Sony's successful handheld platform, the PlayStation Portable, in September of 2006. However, the information revealed that the game would be much different from the mainline Wild Arms titles. This was because the company decided to take the world of Wild Arms and transform it into a 2D tactical RPG for the very first time. And honestly, this was a polarizing decision, even though the game used some really creative concepts that weren't used in many other tactical RPGs. But what were those things, and did this decision pay off? Before I get into that, please like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click the bell below for more retro gaming content and RPG reviews like this one. Just like all the other Wild Arms games, Wild Arms XF takes place in the dying world of Filgaia, where control over the world's natural resources pits the land's kingdoms against each other. As always, the world is filled with drifters, mercenaries who travel around for profit, prestige, or to settle personal scores. The main character is Clarissa, whose mother was slain by a drifter named Rupert Dandridge 5 years before the game begins. And unlike games like Dragon Quest, she isn't a silent protagonist, so our dialogue reveals the heartfelt, dramatic, and even brutal moments of Wild Arms XF. In other words, one could say Clarissa explains it all. Wait, no, that's not the angle I was going for. I mean, yes, but no, but not in that way. Anyway, in pursuit of Rupert and her slain mother's stolen sword, Clarissa and her brother Felius sail to the kingdom of Alessius, where they immediately find themselves in the middle of a power struggle. While there, Clarissa is confused for the heir to the throne of Alessius, who is presumed to have died a year ago under mysterious circumstances. In response to this, Clarissa makes some personal choices that are, well, let's just say pretty risky, and the story takes off from there. Now, I won't spoil anything directly, but I will say that the premise at the heart of this story is super unique, and it hasn't been replicated to any extent in any RPG I've ever played. And since I played hundreds of RPGs, I was honestly pretty impressed by this fact. It's not very cliched and it works well. One thing that's really cool about Wild Arms XF is that it incorporates a lot of super unique mission objectives. For instance, in one area you have to stay out of the line of sight of these patrolling guards while you move between shacks and free prisoners. In another, you have to defend the entrance to a specific area of the map from a group of elite guards, and allowing any of them through means defeat. And these scenarios aren't outliers either, because virtually every battle in the game has a distinct win condition like this, which is a far cry from the good old defeat all enemies over and over thing. This fact made the gameplay feel super involved and really puts Wild Arms XF on a different level compared to other tactical RPGs. It impressed me so much, I'd go as far as to say that the level objectives are more creative than any other game of this type that I've played. Unlike most grid-based tactical RPGs, this one is arranged on a field of hexagons rather than squares, perhaps borrowing a bit from Wild Arms 4 and 5's hex-based battles. You can take advantage of this system by surrounding enemies on multiple sides, which unlocks the ability to execute multi-character formation arts that do increase damage. There's also a class system here where each class has their own unique abilities called originals. In addition to this, fights against enemies yields class skill points, or CSP, which allows your unit's class to level up and learn unique skills that are associated with that class. Using skills in battle consumes magic points, and you can't equip skills you learn onto other classes. On one hand, this makes each class feel like it forced units into a particular archetype, but it also causes Wild Arms XF to lack the customization possibilities that some other tactical RPGs offered. Either way, some of the battles are pretty difficult, and choosing the right combination of classes for your units was crucial. Wild Arms XF has a huge soundtrack of 89 tracks, which is honestly pretty spectacular for a PSP game. It was also created by a relatively large team of 5 people, including several mainstays that had been making music for the series for a long time. With so much selection and variance, it's tough to get sick of it, and the sheer volume made the tracks fit well into specific moments in the game, rather than being just repeated over and over. Frankly, Wild Arms XF blew me away in a manner I've rarely been blown away before. So much so, in fact, that I regret not playing this game back when it came out. The story uses fresh ideas, the characters are interesting, the battle win conditions are super creative, and the gameplay is fun. And honestly, I only have 2 critiques. The first is that I'm not a big fan of the character art dialogue screens because I'd rather have that take place on the battlefields and other locations. Also, the voice acting isn't exactly top-notch either. But those things aren't huge letdowns, and there are plenty of other positives that make this one worth playing. I can't believe this game was never on my radar before, because it's great. I probably missed out on it back when it came out because it wasn't a mainline Wild Arms game, and I suspect I wasn't alone in that. From information I can find on the internet, it looks like it only sold 70,000 copies, a pretty disappointing number for the standards of that time. It's just a shame that this one ended up being the last Wild Arms game ever made, because it's probably one of the best. I consider it among the best RPGs on the PSP, and it still holds up extremely well. I don't think you'll be disappointed if you go out of your way to give this one a try. Unless you're a really hardcore Wild Arms fan, you may not realize that there were other games in the series outside of the 5 mainline titles and Wild Arms XF. The first was Wild Arms Alter Code F, which was released in 2005 as an enhanced remake of the original Wild Arms game. The graphics and sound were given complete overhauls, and several full-motion video cutscenes were added to key parts of the game. The general storyline is largely intact, but several other characters were made playable in addition to the original 3. While the Japanese version featured voice acting, the English release surprisingly didn't feature any voice acting at all. The best improvement in this version, though, was the addition of the battle cancel system that was featured in Wild Arms 2 and 3, which did away with a lot of the monotony that came from random encounters. I haven't completed this version, but I played it enough to realize that it was pretty good. I can't say it really gripped me as much as the original did back in the day, but hey, I'm an old school kind of guy, and that's probably never going to change. The original just had more charm, and that's an intangible that's tough to recreate with remakes. But let me know in the comments if you preferred this version and think I'm totally crazy. In addition to Wild Arms Alter Code F, there was also a Wild Arms mobile series in Japan that first started in 2006. These games went defunct long ago, and there isn't much information on the net about them at all. However, there was a much more recent Wild Arms mobile game released in Japan only. 2018 saw the launch of Wild Arms Million Memories, and series creator Akifumo Kaneko was involved in its creation. Even so, this one was developed by ForwardWorks instead of MediaVision. It also featured a real-time combat system that was really unusual compared to the other titles in the franchise. The game didn't catch on, and its lack of popularity caused it to be discontinued in early 2020, less than 2 years after it was released. Other than those, there are no other Wild Arms games. In fact, there hasn't been a mainline Wild Arms game in nearly 2 decades. Even so, Kaneko has repeatedly tried and failed to continue the Wild Arms series despite resistance from Sony, and the series has gone completely dormant. Shockingly though, information revealed in 2022 raised high hopes for a well-produced game in the same spirit of Wild Arms. This is because a new spiritual successor to Wild Arms, called Armed Fantasia: To the End of the Wilderness, is currently under development and is launched as a successful Kickstarter campaign. The game promises to resurrect the original themes of Wild Arms, including the Western motifs, visual approach, and a musical style, all for a new generation of gamers. As part of a joint campaign with a game called Penny Blood, the Kickstarter has generated over $2.6 million in US dollars, a considerable amount for a project of this size. If Armed Fantasia is successful, maybe it's exactly what fans need to build momentum for a new Wild Arms game. But even if it isn't, the Wild Arms series is still worth celebrating for what it is. Whether for its epic characters and story, its satisfying puzzle solving, or its unique Wild West setting, the franchise continues to live on in the hearts of its fans. Maybe, just maybe, there's still more to come from this illustrious series in the future. So what are your favorite memories from Wild Arms, and which game in the series was your favorite? Let me know in the comments below. Like this video, subscribe to my channel, and click the bell below for more retro gaming content and series retrospectives like this one. I appreciate all my Patreon patrons and YouTube members, and if you're watching this video and you would like early access to the videos I produce and other perks like they receive, please consider supporting the channel by becoming a Patreon patron or via the YouTube Join feature.